really happy to have Ellen Dunham-Jones here. She is Director of the Architecture Program at Georgia Tech. She is the recipient of more than 20 awards for work in architectural design, education, and research, kind of the trifecta there of architecture. Design Intelligences list her as one of the top 30 designers and design leader. She recently published a book. I know that's kind of subtle. It's called Retrofitting Suburbia, and what's really interesting about this is that it is a case study driven book. It's 80 case studies, and the MBAs of the world have been using case studies for decades, but now we're starting to get the data sets. Bill kind of was going in the same direction in the urban economics, but now how does that take a format of redevelopment? So this book is a search for finding design solutions for aging suburbs. It is looking for underperforming asphalt properties that have been redesigned so that they're relevant, walkable, sustainable, vital communities, centers. And in addition to that, Ellen was in Time Magazine recently, and what's really neat is 10 ideas changing the world. And number 2 is repurposing the suburbs. So this is very relevant. The book has excellent timing. It's a fabulous read, and welcome, Ellen Dunham-Jones.
Thank you. I feel much more comfortable speaking before Andres rather than after. So, even though he did already speak this morning, but this works out fine for me. Can everybody hear okay? All right. This is really exciting. I'm a board member on the national board at CNU, and I just want to say how excited I am to see the chapter really getting so many people coming here to the CNU North Texas chapter. It is absolutely fabulous, and you guys are going to change the world. So it's great. So, as Bill said, the book tells the story of over 80 real examples of dead malls, dying office parks, aging residential subdivisions, prototypical suburban development property types that have been redeveloped into more urban, more sustainable places. It's basically, the book is looking at how do we take our least sustainable, most auto-dependent landscapes and re-inhabit them, re-green them, and retrofit them to be much more adaptable to healthy future growth. But before I start describing the specific projects, I'm going to do just a little bit of stage setting, and I'll move through this pretty quickly, but of kind of the big idea. Why should we care? Why is this important? And this is stuff that you guys all know, but let's see. How about that? All right. And Andres and I think all new urbanists are well aware, and have talked about some of the big ideas, the big challenges, and how new urbanism fits into them. Climate change is obviously a huge challenge, and it has everything to do with suburbia. This map shows the CO2 emissions on a per capita basis, and it reveals the trend that is generally true in the U.S., that urban residents have 1/3 the carbon footprint of suburbanites on general. And most of that is obviously because suburbanites drive so much more, and they're generally the detached single-family homes leak so much more energy. So in this map, that's San Francisco and Oakland, who are in the green, healthy green, while it's the farthest flung suburbs that are the yellow, the red, the danger zone. And while it's incredibly important, obviously for the last 50 years, we've been trying to redevelop our downtowns, and we've done a really great job in a lot of cases. And we need to still keep redeveloping our downtowns. But in terms of climate change, San Francisco and Oakland are already green. If we really are serious about what we need to do in order to try to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is to re-green the yellow and the red areas. So it's targeting the suburbs is where we'll get more bang from our buck if we can actually reduce carbon emissions there. So dependency on foreign oil is another obviously extremely big issue. This chart shows the growth in vehicle miles traveled concurrent with the same years that we've just been expanding sprawl. And we all know, really what's been happening there. It's also linked to the problem of peak oil. And, we all saw this last summer, felt the pain. But it really raises questions. We don't know when gas prices are going to go up again, but we know we're not going to have cheap fuel for our vehicles forever. So what will that mean to suburban living? When gas prices exceed last summer's highs, how are we going to really reduce vehicle miles traveled and gas consumption? The foreclosure crisis, as Bill was talking about, is obviously another huge issue. This slide could just as easily have been titled The Financial Meltdown. And this happens to be a map of Atlanta. Atlanta and Dallas are certainly relatively similar boom era cities. And we see that the majority of foreclosures have been happening on the edges. They've been happening, at least in many of these, happening in the newer built suburbs. And what this also points to, I think, is this question of where we've been building our so-called affordable housing. The Brookings and the Center for Neighborhood Technologies, working also some with Reconnecting America, Shelley Patisha will talk about later, did an amazing study looking at transportation cost in addition to housing cost. And part of what we see, and I know of a lot of the folks who work at Georgia Tech, some of the lower paid folks, they live in the most so-called affordable housing, the furthest out. When gas prices peaked last summer, I had staff members telling me they couldn't afford to come to work 5 days a week. Would I please allow them to work 4 days for longer days? Because they were living so far out. They bought the cheapest house they could on the biggest lot, what seemed like the biggest bargain. But the reality was, in Atlanta, half of households make between $20,000 and $50,000 a year. And for those folks in Atlanta, and I don't know I should have looked up the numbers for Dallas, it's got to be pretty similar. I mean, if I asked all of you in the room, what do you spend per month on housing? You could all very quickly give me an answer. What percent of your income, if I said what percent is how much you spend on housing, that would take you another minute, but very quickly you could work that out. If I asked you what percent of your income do you spend on transportation, most of you would have to really scratch your heads, because suddenly you've got to add up the cost of the car, the insurance, depreciation, the gas, how much do I, parking, most of us don't really add it up. In Atlanta, for those folks making between $20,000 and $50,000 a year, they're spending 32% of their income. And that's 2005 numbers. That's not summer 2007. They're only spending 29% on housing. So, the cost of transportation is suddenly that expensive in-town condo may not be actually so expensive relative to that affordable house out on the edge. But it does, I think, the location of a lot of those foreclosed homes and the transportation costs that peaked last summer absolutely figured in to a lot of families not being able to pay those mortgages. Just one more of the factors. So here's what we've been building. And while we can't pin the blame for all of the world's problems on sprawl, much as I'd probably kind of like to, I admit, I'm a new urbanist, the fact is that there is a significant link between climate change, peak oil, dependence on foreign oil, and the foreclosure crisis. And resolving these problems, therefore, also involves creatively and critically rethinking our development patterns. So, for the last 50 years, the big design and development project has been to build suburbia. The big design and development project for the next 50 years is retrofitting suburbia. And I really love when I'm an academic, talking to students and really making it clear, this is the project for your generation. And the issue is not so much about what it looks like, but that it has to be pedestrian, friendly, climate sensitive, compact, and attractive to a variety of people. Now, drawings like this make it look relatively easy. Okay, we just, build on top of the parking lots with buildings that are now straight up to the street, and we can get some little bit more density in there. They're much more compact. Maybe get a couple of stories, put the parking in the rear. Makes it look very easy. But the reality is that suburbia is actually highly resistant to adaptation. As we know, adaptation is one of those key factors usually used when we describe survival of the species. Adaptation comes to mind. If we think of something, 1811, the commissioners for New York City drew up the plan for Manhattan in 1811. That's when the grid was established. They didn't know what a skyscraper was. They didn't know that the block they were designing could accommodate single detached houses all the way to skyscrapers. But the reality is that grid has been remarkably adaptable. It can grow in density, it can shrink down, it can adapt to a variety of things, to a variety of situations and buildings. Suburbia has, the layout of a subdivision is so specific. The location, the twisting patterns of those roads is very different from the layout of a shopping mall, or the layout of the office park, or the layout of the garden apartment housing complex, making it actually very different. They're so specialized, they don't adapt very well. And as they age, become out of date, like things that don't adapt, they begin to die. So retrofitting is an absolutely, I think, essential task we need to take on, but it is not just as easy as okay, let's build on top of the parking lots, although that's certainly part of it. A lot of times it requires significant demolition and really rebuilding, replatting, rezoning. Now, luckily, there are some very strong dynamics that work in favor of retrofitting. Number one is suburban job growth. Since 2000, 60% of U.S. metro jobs have been in the suburbs, and their growth has outpaced cities 6 times that since between 2000 and 2006. So while most of that job growth doesn't all look quite like this image outside Chicago, but while most of it is completely auto-dependent, whether it's the office park or it's just the isolated office tower, it's still the fact that there's so much of the growth is happening out in the suburbs means that it provides a great opportunity for densification and, probably even more importantly, a supply of young professionals who are not yet settled down and are actually looking for more urban living options than what the suburbs currently provide. So those new workers are a lot of the reason behind the market for retrofits. But they're not, the young professionals is only one of the factors in the biggest demographic shift that we've seen in a long time, which in particular is the severe reduction in households with kids. When we started building the post-war suburbs in earnest in the 50s and 60s, half of U.S. households had children in them. Today, less than a third have households with them, and it's dropping. At this point, only the Ozzie and Harriet stereotype of a stay-at-home mom, go-to-work dad with kids, less than 7% of U.S. households. And that's really what the suburban pattern, the building stock, really was based on. Since 2000, 65% of suburban households have not had kids in them. Demographers predict that between now and 2025, 75 to 85% of new households will not have kids in them. So if you are a suburban community and you want to population's still growing, you want to tap in to some of that new growth, any of that new growth, take a look. If all you permit are single-family homes, how appropriate do you think? How big is the market for single-family homes for the growing number of single-person households? Suburbia has done a fabulous job at providing, maximizing privacy for this young family. It does a great job of that. But if you're a single person, in a single-person household, all of that privacy kind of gets you loneliness, whether you're a young professional or whether you're a retiring baby boomer, which is the other really big demographic bubble, and that is also impacting suburbia. So right now, in 2015 is when demographers say that these two big bubbles will both peak: the aging, retiring boomers and the millennials or Generation Y, echo boomers. They go by a couple different names. But it's what's particularly interesting is that we actually, and both of those groups are interested in the same kinds of environments. A demographic term I particularly like is YIPIes, youthful, energetic, elderly people into everything. I sense a little self-recognition out there. The YIPIes do not want to they don't want to end up in the same retirement home that they just put their own mom and dad in. They are desperate to avoid it. And yet, the boomers have built a habitat that they cannot age in place in at all well or easily. So the YIPIes are a group that it's not all, but it's about 25% of retiring boomers sort of indicate that they're okay with the idea of moving to an age-restricted place, but 75% say, no way. Give me I want a mixed age, mixed use. I want an environment, it has to be safe, but I want to be able to walk places. I don't want to have to drive. I want access to transit. And this is the group that has been the target market their entire lives. They're not going to go down easy on not getting what they want. Although they may not have a whole lot of choices. So you've got that's sort of what the boomers are asking for. And meanwhile, the millennials, it's surprising. This group, they're idealistic 22-year-olds right now. So you have to take their surveys with a little grain of salt. But 77% say they want to live in an urban core. This is the same group that 75% of them grew up in suburbia. They are absolutely, even though many of them grew up in the exact same suburb that their mom and dad grew up in, when mom and dad grew up, summertime, they would get on the bike, leave the house, say, see you, Mom, I'll be back at time for dinner. They were allowed to free range around suburbia, not their own kids. The kids, and I say kids, but folks in their 20s now that grew up in suburbia, they were not allowed to free range at all. They were driven absolutely everywhere. They were the overscheduled kids, and they don't want to become their chauffeur mom and dad. So just like the boomers don't want to become mom and dad in their mom and dad in the retirement home, their kids also don't want to become the mom and dad who have to shuttle the kids everywhere. 70% of the millennials also say that even when they have kids, they are confident they will not move to the suburbs. Now, again, these are idealistic kids, but these are big numbers in terms of their preferences. So you actually get this convergence. In 2015 is when we're going to see both of these groups at their peak numbers, and both groups are asking for environments that we're not really providing a whole lot for. If they want to live downtowns, yes, we've got downtowns, but the jobs have all moved out to the suburbs. Are we going to start seeing a whole lot of reverse commutes? Well, maybe. But there's certainly an opportunity here, and the opportunity gets really at this third dynamic, which is at a certain level, it's one that's just simply a matter of time. We've been building suburbs in a leapfrog development pattern now for about 50 years. The first ring of suburbs gets built, and they're happy to be suburbs. They don't want to be urban at all. They deliberately built out on the edge, and they built a very auto-dependent, because that was fun, that was cool, to drive everywhere. Then the next generation leapfrogged them. Then again, 5 miles out, 10 miles out, 15 miles out. Those first generation of malls, office parks, subdivisions, all started to lose value. They were getting a little old. The malls started to die. But ironically, that exact same process, because it's been going on for so long now, those first suburbs that were the original ones that were leapfrogged now have a relatively central position within their metro. They're no longer at the edge. Suddenly, they're prime for redevelopment. They're actually considered central. They've gotten an office job base. They've become destinations. They are no longer just bedroom suburbs. So we're beginning to see that now. In this diagram on the left, some of you will recognize the drawing by Joel Garreau from his book on Edge Cities from 1991. It's a diagram of showing the metropolitan Washington area and various edge cities. They were almost always located on suburban spoke and hub intersections. And they followed the leapfrog pattern. They were constantly, the newer ones were constantly further and further out. We did a diagram looking at Washington, D.C. now and looking at where the retrofits are occurring. And instead, what we're seeing is that they're all located on transit lines. And they're now coming in. And this is where the real opportunities are coming from. And those opportunities have a lot to do with the availability of underperforming asphalt. All of those, particularly the sort of aging retail sites, garden apartment sites, office parks, basic property types where you have a box surrounded by parking, and especially if it was sort of pre-66, the parking standards then, you could actually called for 10 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet, whereas today we only call for 4, and you can even get to 3 or 2 if you get enough of a mix of uses. So suddenly you've got all this parking that, frankly, you could be building on for free at one level without even having to deal with structured parking. And yet, if this underperforming asphalt is located now in a relatively central location within the region, well, there's no reason that now it's not justified to be just surface parking lot at all. It absolutely makes sense to pay for the decked parking, build up 3, 4, 18 stories, and to really redevelop these places. Chris Nelson, professor now at University of Utah, estimated in 2006 that by 2015 there would be 2.8 million acres of gray fields, basically surface parking lot dominated sites, available for redevelopment. If a quarter of those were redeveloped, we could meet half the country's housing needs. Orange County, California, did a survey. They found they had over 800 strip malls. They found that at least half of them were underperforming, really turning in very low rents, still making some money, but not much. And they estimated that if they redeveloped their strip malls, they could not only meet all of their county's housing needs for the next 30 years, but they could also do it pretty darn affordably. So there are, and that, again, Nelson's numbers, I think, the estimate that it would take by 2015, well, he was making those estimates back in the boom years, with all of the bankruptcies and the degree of which we are seeing a correction in, I think, a very over-retailed situation and starting to see a lot of contraction in the amount of retail now. We're going to hit those numbers tomorrow, today, I don't know, very soon. I don't think it's going to take us very long. So these opportunities are really, I think, pretty substantial. Now, so looking now at some of the projects, some of the retrofits have been very modest, and I know Bill Giedema disagrees with me. He thinks this is actually not even, we shouldn't even show examples like this, but I'm going to go ahead and show this, also because it's in the Dallas area. Up in Denton, a Food Lion grocery store was converted to a public library. This is one of numerous examples we found of ghost boxes, the name for dead big box stores, that have been converted to much more community-serving uses. So, and on the one hand, environmentally, there's a little more green space. They cut out about 80 parking spaces to put in a little more green, permeable surface, xeriscape. They put in some sidewalks to connect with, better connect to the neighborhood. But basically, this is still a very auto-dependent property, but it did take, along a commercial strip of otherwise entirely private uses, there's now a public use, something adding a little more community identity. And some of these examples I put in almost just because they're amusing. The Kmart has now been turned into the Museum of Spam, the meat product. And there's an architecture firm in Missouri that specializes in converting dead Walmarts into megachurches. And, one can kind of laugh and ironic, but it's a pretty good fit. And actually, even socially, there are interviews with the pastors of one of the Walmart churches who said, honestly, my constituents, when they go downtown to a stone cathedral, they feel very intimidated. They don't feel comfortable. They are more comfortable worshiping in a building that used to be a Walmart. So, just tells you something about our culture. Larger impacts do absolutely involve larger parcels. This is a subdivision that was entirely bought up. The developer went around, knocked on each door, individually contracted to buy 69 houses, and has received permission for a 30-fold increase in density because it's located right at a transit stop on the Metro rail system just outside of D.C. Now, there are lots of buying up entire subdivisions is actually a little more common than you'd think. There's one in Atlanta, a subdivision that actually self-organized and put themselves up for sale because so many neighbors had developers knocking on their doors. There are 3 subdivisions in Atlanta that have recently been bought up to be redeveloped. I don't know in Dallas, but it's a curious thing because culturally, we tend to all be very proud. We expect our cities to be dynamic. We're proud when we see cranes in downtown. But culturally, there's a pretty strong sentiment that we have a right to expect that the suburbs will remain forever frozen in whatever form they were first built out in. And the reality is, no, nobody really has that right. And that they're getting old, and population is still growing, and there's infrastructure already there. There are ways these properties can be better used. Now, I don't have time to show the full range of property types that we found retrofit examples of, but it includes aging garden apartment complexes, older golf courses, car dealerships, park and rides, office parks, industrial parks. We found almost every category of suburban development you could name. We found an example somewhere of of it being redeveloped in a more urban way. What I will show are a couple of the dead mall projects, because they're both the most dramatic and they're actually one of the more prolific types. This is Mizner Park, which was a very early retrofit from 1990. It was a public-private partnership because when the mall died, the land defaulted back to the city. The city set up a redevelopment agency and required that 30% of the land remain as public space. That requirement then led to the design, which basically makes a long linear park, very lush, beautiful green park, that is then lined on two sides with streets that have ground floor retail and apartments and offices up above. It's been amazingly successful, surprised all sorts of skeptics. It's had subsequent phases that have just added much more and more sort of upscale. It's become more upscale, actually, as it has aged rather than downscale. It has now outlived the mall that it replaced. And it's become the second largest contributor of tax revenue in the city. And is pretty routinely referred to now as Boca's downtown. So Mizner Park has been quite an interesting project. It's still an example, however, though, of basically drive to walkable urbanism. It makes this great public space. There's lots of nightlife there. Lots of young professionals really hang out at the restaurants and cafes. But it doesn't really connect. This great linear park and the streets don't really connect to anything else around them. The side that faces the highway still looks like the side of any mall. It's parking garages along the side of the highway. So it remains rather disconnected. But there are lots of examples. This one is an example of building on top of an existing mall. In this case, a dying, but not entirely dead mall. This is Surrey Central City. It's about 45 minutes outside of Vancouver in a booming area that really wanted to, their mindset was they wanted to put themselves on the map. They said, we've arrived, we've got a booming economy. So they wanted to build up. And so they convinced a university to build 5 stories of classrooms above the mall. And they just took the atrium of the mall and extended it up 5 more stories. They did it very well, so only 8 new columns had to be punched in. The mall stayed open while they did this. Then they built a 25-story high-rise for incubator office space to also spin off from the university. The university uses the mall's food court as its student center, and it's all on a light rail line. So it's a pretty interesting, very synergistic project. Very contemporary architecture. They reused and recycled various building materials, including pine cores that are usually a waste product, made a big space frame. Again, really the ambition was to put a stake in the ground that said, yeah, we're in a suburban location, but we're urban. We've arrived, was sort of the mindset. It was quite a different story in Belmar, which is another, I think, really fabulous project. But Belmar in Lakewood, Colorado, about 5 miles outside of Denver, had a very large mall sitting on a 100-acre site. And folks, the town loved their mall. There were people who had memories. We had our prom in that mall. That was the town center. And when the mall died, again, the land defaulted to the city. And the city said, let's find a developer to fix the mall. Well, they tried. No takers. Reality is we have not built an enclosed mall in this country in the last 2 years. Not one. We have been building open-air lifestyle centers. And a lot of that does have to do with the changing demographics in suburbia. The open-air lifestyle centers tend to be much more oriented to the empty nesters and the young professionals. They have nightlife. They have sit-down restaurants, not the food instead of the food court. There's a shift. I think it also has a lot to do with, when malls opened, air conditioning wasn't that prevalent. And going to the air-conditioned mall was a big idea. That was a cool, literally cool way to spend the day. Today, it's the opposite. We all spend it seems like 99% of our time indoors. We've got with both mom and dad working. Now, the thrill, if you want to have any downtime at all, it's to be outside. So the shift, malls have really not, there are a couple of big malls being planned in the country, but very, very few. And as I said, we haven't opened any in the last 2 years. So Lakewood did find a developer, Continuum Partners, who came and said, look, we don't want to fix your mall, but we'd be interested in building a new downtown for you. And Lakewood's initial reaction was, downtown? We don't need a downtown. We're a suburb. And Continuum said, well, you are the 4th largest municipality in Colorado. And it took them a little while, but Lakewood has now completely embraced it, and they actually really, really love I think this project. It's been extremely successful and very green, and I'll get into a little more detail on it later. But the 104-acre site, which was just one big super block, has now been transformed into 22 separate urban blocks with public streets and parks that are now deeded to the city. But it took a mindset change for Lakewood to sort of say, okay, we're going urban. Well, who knew? But that is absolutely what has happened. And part of what is interesting about Belmar is shown here in the red star. This is a map of the regional malls in the Denver metro area. And Belmar has been such a success, as well as Englewood City Center, another one on the map here, that now they've done so well that, in fact, my slide is out of date because I heard of another one. It's now 8 out of the 13 regional malls in the Denver area have announced plans to be retrofitted. So once people see what's possible, once people see the market acceptance for these projects, once people see good examples of the ways in which suddenly you take a dying or dead property, revitalize it, and in the process provide more urban housing options for people who haven't had that choice in your community and who you may not have thought that anybody was really looking for it, but gee, it turns out that, in fact, some of your longtime residents are actually like the idea of staying in the community, but are interested in downsizing to live in a condo. At the same time, suddenly now, your kids are saying, well, gee, I'd be happy to stay in the community, but I sure don't want a single-family house. I want to live where the action is. And so you get, suddenly once people begin to see that, we see the market absolutely tip. But what this map also brings up is the question of, okay, so we build these pockets of walkability. And there are real advantages. When you develop a mixed-use center like this, generally you can absolutely count on getting between 25 to 30% internal trip capture rate, which is sort of parking transportation engineer talk for arguing that even though you're increasing the density on that site, you're actually capturing about 30%, and actually there's some new data that shows if you really get a good synergy between the uses, it can be up to 45% of the trips are captured on site. People are walking between uses rather than getting in their cars. So even though, yes, you're adding more people, Belmar tripled density on the site and did not have to add a single new traffic light anywhere in the neighborhood. And it seems counterintuitive, but they increase the density. Isn't that going to do, horrific things for traffic? Yes, the immediate streets right next to the site, sure, there's more traffic on them. But they just accommodated an additional 1,000 residents who now are only, those residents, 30% of those residents' trips are being handled on site. If those same residents had moved anywhere else in Lakewood, all of that would be 30% more trips that would be on the roads and having an impact. So on the one hand, making those pockets of walkability is absolutely a good thing to do, absolutely important, and it does have an impact. But the question is, how do we have it have even more impact? How do we get it a systemic kinds of changes so that we begin to connect the dots and really make this even a networked system with the retrofits? And one of the answers, in part, is to retrofit the connections themselves, the commercial strip corridors, the arterials, so that the roadways themselves can begin to foster redevelopment. Now, there's various strategies for this, and new urbanists have been working on these for a long time, whether it's streetscaping for walkability, putting in street trees, wider sidewalks, getting the roads on a road diet, ideally getting transit, making transit boulevards out of arterials. That's also some interesting rethinking of the arterials. The lower left side is of a one-way couplets, but two of them overlap, where you take arterials, split them into one-ways, and then overlap them so that at least the distance is now a walkable distance to cross each leg of them, so that you can actually still urbanize around the intersection. There are various strategies. There's some interesting rezoning ideas of trying to, that haven't been implemented yet, but that I think are being discussed. Transferring development rights from the in-between intersections to then densifying them at the nodes. And given, again, the over-retailing, I think we're going to start seeing, the reality of people being able to realistically think that they're going to just, even though those arterials are zoned for commercial all the way along, there's no way that retail is coming back to really fill all those spaces along the arterials. Now is the opportunity to transfer the development rights to the nodes and at least get where there's retail to get it where there's a synergy with other uses. There's also opportunities to rezone along individual properties. In Atlanta, we've got some pretty major commercial strips, pretty ugly, big super blocks, no connectivity. And there's a proposal out to allow people to now build in the front setback, encourage them to build right up to the road in exchange for 15-foot easement at their side setbacks. Because if two neighbors are willing to do that, then we've got a space for a road to go through. And so let it just happen incrementally as owners so choose. It won't work for every parcel, because not every parcel is going to be able to fit the parking in the back. But for those that do, why not? Let's allow these things. So there are, I think, again, lots of opportunities out there. The only one that I know of that's been built, and I think it's a fabulous project, though, in many ways, is in Cathedral City, California. Cathedral City is more or less sort of the poorer sister to Palm Springs, but it's on the same road. And they had, what was their main street was a state road, and the California DOT said, okay, sorry folks, we're widening the highway. There went their main street. Their main street became a commercial strip, and so the images at the bottom are sort of what was left of the main street, really just a very banal commercial strip. Then 15 years later, DOT came back and said, guess what? We're widening it again. This time Cathedral City fought back, said, you touch that road this time, we want our Main Street back. And Friedman, Tongue and Bottomley worked with them. They actually transferred ownership of the state road to the city. Pretty amazing, but they did it. It worked out. They built 4 blocks of a multi-way boulevard that has the through traffic still moves very quickly through the center lanes. The side lanes are much slower, have pull-in parking, have to support the retail, transit, have the spaces for the buses. They built their own city. They built their city hall there. They built a new park, and they really made it an attractive environment. The trees are serving various purposes, but in particular, they're making it attractive. And they've been able to attract new hotels to actually come in. They've made it an address that now people want to actually be on. And this is really key. If for that Orange County study of saying, well, we could solve our housing problems if we could redevelop all the strip malls. Well, no one's going to want to live on the strip unless you retrofit the strip itself. I wish if I was in charge of where the stimulus bill infrastructure spending was going, I would be retrofitting our existing commercial strips, and ideally to also turn them into transit boulevards, but so that it absolutely allows us to reinvigorate real estate values instead of building more highways, which will simply give us more, we'll end up with more sprawl. But the reality is, all of the projects I've shown so far depend on densification. And densification is simply not going to work everywhere. Sometimes regreening is the more appropriate strategy. And it's long been popular with land banks in cities. Cities and suburbs facing shrinking populations, such as Flint and Detroit, Michigan. Their strategies for converting foreclosed properties into gardens and parks to stabilize home values and protect long-term natural resources like water and air may become more spread as we find, as we're forced to really deal with foreclosures and unsold ex-urban redevelopments. Another form of regreening is the suburban farming movement, converting suburban lawns into vegetable gardens. And this is apparently really particularly popular. Boulder, Colorado has a really active one, but they use the internet to coordinate whose driveway becomes the farmer's market of the day. And the road revolves around various subdivisions. So regreening is actually happening in all sorts of surprising ways. My co-author and I were also quite interested in this example from Phelan, Minnesota, where a dead shopping center that was located in a low-income area, but it was also on the site of a drained wetland and on a major migratory bird route. The University of Minnesota succeeded in convincing local officials that restoring the wetland would create lakefront property, revitalizing the area and its ecology. And they really succeeded. They built a quite lovely lake and boardwalk. It worked, but I'm going to come back to this project again at the end. And so regreening, retrofitting as the full redevelopment, regreening, sometimes the best strategy is to do nothing at all beyond encouraging re-inhabitation. Now, when you re-inhabit an existing site, and it might be some adaptive reuse, you're not fundamentally helping people get out of the automobile, their dependence on the automobile, but you are still helping to serve communities. And we see a lot of older retail sites with small community-owned businesses like these shown here, serving new immigrant groups with small mom-and-pop shops, health clinics, and job training. And I think these are very important, and often cases, I think a lot of these really are serving their communities in ways that I would not want to see them be redeveloped, and they're fully functioning economies, even if they sometimes seem to be bringing the world into the suburbs where the suburbs haven't quite been used to seeing them. But reinhabitation, the reality is I'm just starting to see shopping centers and malls becoming more and more mixed use, somewhat by default. This is a mall in New York State that brought in one office user at a time until it ended up becoming a business court. It still has a small food court that now works very well at serving the offices, and a daycare center. This is the plan of a mall in St. Louis that began leasing store spaces to artists, dance troupes, galleries, theater companies, and is now called Art Space. They really initially it started, they'd lost a few retailers, and so they just brought in a few artists, but as the economy has continued to collapse, they're finding a lot more nonprofits than they are retailers willing to come in. We're seeing non-conventional tenants, such as fitness centers, churches, health clinics, discounters, all beginning to fill various wings of the mall, if not the entire building, as in these two examples. So we're seeing it, which does begin to introduce a certain aspect of urbanity, I wouldn't call it urbanism, but into these suburban property types. So this is happening just all over the place. So what are these places like? This is another dead mall retrofit that turns a single mall building, proposes to turn, it's under construction right now, proposes to turn a big one-story mall building into 3 to 4 story mixed-use neighborhood, designed by Duane Plater-Zyberg, uses a very place-based geometry. I observed the charrette for this project and was really impressed with how the designers, every little tweak in the plan was so as to focus a view on a particular mountain peak. This is right outside Salt Lake City, or to align it as a visual terminus to an approaching road. It also, similar to many of the retrofit projects, the densest part of the plan is in the middle of the site, and then it sort of tapers in density to the edges where it meets the rest of the suburb. Also, as is typical in a lot of these projects, there's always, how the retrofits deal with the existing arterial. If the arterial has not been retrofitted and made attractive, generally a lot of these projects end up sort of caving and, we're putting in surface parking. Eventually, we'll be able to urbanize that. And in this case, Whole Foods was located right at the prime arterial intersection and insisted on 300 surface lots, right, parking spaces right in front. And so that key urban corner is still going to feel pretty suburban, not all that urban. But by and large, the project, it really has a wonderful sense of place and enclosure, the kinds of things that Andres has been talking about. It's the architecture really draws on the architectural traditions of the region, and it's design. The plan is such to allow for different architects to design the different produce the designs for the different buildings, in different offices, so as to get the look and feel of incremental urbanism, so that it feels like a place that has evolved over time. And this gets at, I think, a critical issue of quality in these places that, all of us, I think, really know and love the feeling of when we go to an authentic, real place that has evolved over time and has that patina of multiple generations have contributed to this place. I belong to something larger. What mark am I going to leave? I can see all the marks of all the places. I mean, we love those places that have evolved over time, and you really can read them and see them and feel them. Rich, wonderful urban cities have always been like that. At the same time, we tend to hold in utter disdain anything that seems instant. Instant seems fake, seems phony, seems, certainly less desirable. New urbanist projects often get accused of being instant urbanism and feeling dissatisfying, feeling a little fake and phony. This is from a retrofit in downtown Silver Spring. the public green is actually AstroTurf. It doesn't get much more faux than that. It's intended to be a temporary public space until they build the city hall, but it's AstroTurf nonetheless. But I show it here, because it's sort of amusing, but really because I think there's actually a very important lesson here. It gets at also the ambiguity in some of these places. This was designed as public space. Everything about it, the way buildings face it, this is supposed to be a public green. And yet a photographer was out there taking photographs, and a security guard came up to him and said, "Absolutely not, sir. Put away your tripod. This is private space. You are no photographs allowed." As someone who's been photographing these places, I know this is actually fairly common. You get out a tripod at any mall or privately owned retail environment, and you'll generally be told to put it away. But this particular photographer got really mad, and he said, "Now, wait a second. This was a public-private partnership. The city owns this land. They're just leasing it to the developer for $1 a year. I demand that public rights." And he organized a protest on the 4th of July, got a bunch of people to show up, lots of media attention, and guess what? The town and the developer all said, okay, you can take photographs. In fact, yes, we will grant all rights of public space to these spaces. There is nothing more that I could ever ask of a public space than that it host a protest that actually changes the laws. This is democracy in action on AstroTurf. And if that's what it takes, hallelujah. So, I can get upset. I'm an architect, and I look at a lot of these projects, and I do wince at a lot of the architecture, because the architecture is often what I would call instant architecture. It's detailed like brick paint. I mean, it's not, you just look at it and you kind of, it's not built to last. It's not built like what it's intended to look like. And frankly, I'm a modern architect. I'd like to see these buildings really embrace the 21st century and the new revitalization of the suburbs. But I understand why it's okay if neo-traditional design is more desired. That's fine. Just do it well. And sometimes it's done great. Sometimes it's just instant architecture. It feels stamped out, and it's not. It's certainly not very good. Now, but it actually turns out there are lots of parts of cities that were the instant urbanism in their day that are now much beloved. The entire South End in Boston, huge swaths of the brownstones in Brooklyn. This is Morningside Heights in Upper West Side of Manhattan, built out in 13 years, and really, it's the same size as kind of a large mall. Nowadays, we think of it's had time for the patina of changes and additions. The trees have matured. I mean, we never would look at this and think of it as instant urbanism now. But because the bones were in place, because it's set up to accommodate and allow for that change, and it did get the pattern, the fundamental pattern of blocks, streets, and lots right. Instant urbanism can be a fabulous place. Now, but we do get into this sort of hybridity of a lot of these retrofits. So as I mentioned, we get sort of public space with public in quotes. It's under private management and ownership, but it may appear public. There may or may not really be the rights that go along with that. Most of these places have very urban streetscapes, but because of their context, they still have very suburban parking ratios. And we haven't done nearly enough research to really do the post-occupancy evaluation and really know how much are people really driving or not. They tend to have urban qualities, but at suburban costs, and that's often where the thin architecture comes in. They're very much about local placemaking, but they rely on a lot of national retailers, national designers, national developers. They have populations that are more diverse than a typical suburb, or what we think of as typical suburbia, but less diverse, especially in income, than typical cities. And of course, then we get at that these are hybrid places, and they're this instant urbanism. But so okay, yes, they're instant urbanism, but I will defend it. And I will encourage you to absolutely embrace instant urbanism, because in suburbia, we need it. We can't incrementally change suburban behavior. The only way we're going to get people out of their cars is to actually build big enough chunks of this and redevelop enough of it that we can actually, at a critical mass, that you really do get the synergies and uses where people start walking. I mean, at about 15-acre sites, you can get a significant sense of place, but it really takes more like 40 acres to actually start getting enough uses that people will start to substantially reduce their driving. And then if you get bigger sites and more of them, then we start to really see the changes. So the uses of the and over time, the uses of the buildings can change, the buildings can be remodeled, but what really matters is retrofitting the morphological structure of streets, blocks, and lots so that we really make the long-term differences. So I think I wish we had better metrics, and one of the things that CNU does a lot of is, member-involved initiatives where we come together and we sort of figure out what are some of the metrics that we need to put together. We gather the data collectively so that we can rewrite the standards, change those regulations. And Galina Tachieva, who works at DPZ, is working with both Andres and I on an initiative on retrofitting suburbia, and I would love to get more CNU members to really work with us to figure out what are the best metrics that we really need to come up with to measure the performance of these places. And performance as measured in various ways, because the reality is we just don't have great data right now. So what we do, what June and I did with our book, is we certainly, for each of these case studies, we researched the site history, the actors and factors behind the retrofit. We looked at the underlying morphological structure, because that was the one thing we really could measure, the change to the blocks, lots, and buildings. And then we also looked at the demographic context and speculated on the future impacts of this. But really, I think the task for new urbanists is to fundamentally change the urban structure and not, worry so much about the individual buildings. Now, part of what we drew on some of the research by Brenda Case-Shearer that is, I think she's studied suburban form in particular and comes up with 3 different this is academic stuff, but I think it's really very useful. She differentiates suburbia into what she calls static tissues, campus tissues, and elastic tissues. Residential subdivisions fall in the category of static tissues. The small platting of lots of different individual owners means that they become quite resistant to adaptation. You'll get adaptation at the scale within the lot, but you get residential additions. In fact, we studied 3 of the earliest Levittown projects, and in the original Levittown, there's literally 1 building left that has not been remodeled in some way, and only because it's got historic designation status. So, there's lots of change at the scale of the individual house, but not to the urban form in static tissues. Campus tissues are characterized by single owner, very large lots that might have multiple buildings, but in those cases, change sort of happens, if change happens at all, it will tend to happen quite suddenly because the owner of the land decides, okay, I'm ready for change. And we found certainly quite a lot of retrofits that were campus tissues, although, as I said, are relatively rare on the static tissues. Elastic tissues are what Brenda K. Shear uses to describe sort of, the landscapes along arterial strips, where you have multiple lots, multiple buildings, but you also have a lot of change, very dynamic, constantly new buildings coming in, buildings being torn down. A lot of change, even though it is sort of multiple owners and multiple lots. But and we certainly found also a lot of, their sort of zoning codes or changes to the street itself will tend to be the drivers of change. And so that, you can begin to look at suburbia and begin to say, it's not all going to change, be retrofitted by any means. There are certain kinds of sites that are more common. So to go through a couple of the case studies, this is Mashpee Commons, which was begun in 1986. It's the oldest project that we studied. It's designed by Duane Plater-Zybert, now over 20 years old. It's outlasted the shopping center that it replaced as well. It's on Cape Cod, and really has gone from being a shopping center to now a town center, or sort of a New England village. The black and white photograph shows the shopping center as it used to be, and some of the buildings remained. It wasn't completely torn down, but it was sort of reintegrated now into a new village. So in the darker orange, you see the new village center, which basically just meant building the new retail buildings on the parking lot. And in fact, it was illegal to have on-street parking, so they just called the streets parking lots and, got around the zoning. But there was a lot of that in retrofitting, very creative rethinking. What's exciting about the project now, though, is it's now being added to with residential neighborhoods. Now, this particular project, though, this was a family-owned development. The family owned quite a lot of land around the project, but it's taken almost over 20 years to finally get the permissions to build the neighborhoods. There is so much resistance to densification on Cape Cod. They happen to be near a lot of cranberry bogs, some very environmentally sensitive areas, and it's, even though Mashpee Commons has been very successful, it's quite popular. There are now several other retrofits on Cape Cod that are trying to get permission by saying, we want to be another Mashpee Commons. But they're finding a lot of difficulty, and in part, it's in very strong resistance on Cape Cod to private developers and develop any kind of densification. So this one has been very, very slow going. But it is really, I think, a very interesting example, very early example of how to transform a simple strip shopping center. And one of the interesting strategies that Mashpee came up with was they really wanted to have a balance between national chain stores and local retailers, and they deliberately designed little skinny retail buildings that they knew would be way too small for any of the national chains. And so those screen the parking, what are still some of the remaining parking surface lots, and they become incubator business spaces for local retailers. And what's particularly interesting right now, I haven't talked to the developers in several months, but at least as of, I believe it was April last year, they were not only not yet feeling the pain of the economy crashing and retail contracting, they were fully leased up, had a waiting list, and credited it to the fact that they had so many local retailers. One of the things that I think is actually very interesting, local retailers are also struggling, and these developers have really done a lot to nurture and help their local retailers. But I think since the 60s, the banking underwriting laws have required that retail developers, you don't get your loan to build your shopping center or strip mall unless you can show them that you have leases from AAA credit tenants. And credit tenants are only national retailers. That's why we have the retail landscape, suburban retail landscape that we do. It's only generally the older retail where the locals can get a foothold. But it's really going to be interesting to see how things play out, whether indeed local retail actually now is doing better than the national retailers. The national retailers have really been caught in much the same sort of mortgage mess that residential, not the same, but they also over-leveraged to try to expand during the boom years and are being caught now not able to pay back their loans. And so you're getting retailers who are going bankrupt, shuttering stores all over the place, not because those individual stores were underperforming, but just because the retailer can't pay off their loans and the banks are demanding it back. So the strategies, the balance, whether or not we're going to get to the point where we actually start to see banks only underwriting retail development if there's some local in the mix, I'm hopeful. I don't know if we'll really get there. So here's the morphology changes. This is what Mashpee Commons looked like in 1985 with the strip shopping center. And then by 2005, where it's really, it's been added to somewhat. There's a church, some senior housing, a public library, residences above the stores, and it really has become the default town center of Mashpee. But here's the hope for 2025, where it not only is it the town center, but it connects across arterials to new walkable neighborhoods. And that to get the connection across the arterials, it will really be a pretty astounding accomplishment. But certainly hopeful that that's kind of where they're going. The next case study is Belmar. Belmar, as I said, is about 104-acre site, 4.5 miles outside of Denver. And here's the plan showing now 22 urban blocks. The plan sort of makes puts most of the density sort of in the middle of the site. Up on the top of the slide, you see that those are some surface lots parking lots that face the arterial. Although they do use the parking lots as wind farms. They have little turbines up on the light standards that are generating enough power for the lights and to run the parking meters and things. But there are two main public spaces. I don't have a pointer, but you can sort of see the yellow spot on the slide is one of the public spaces. That becomes a skating rink in winter and a hardscape public space in the summer. And then just below that and to the right a little bit is a square, the green square, which has the trees there making an oval. And that becomes a center for a lot of more residential development, whereas the yellow square is more a sort of public space that's anchoring where more of the retail is. There are 8 bus lines that have come in, and they have stops at both of the main squares as they sort of do a loop around and through the project. And the project will be about 2 blocks away from light rail once the light rail comes in. There is quite a range of housing types. If you look here around that green square, it's mostly stacked flats, but to the east side of the project there, where you see the much finer grain, you see both townhouses and some muse projects that are really quite interesting. And then above all the shops is all both office, apartment, condo, and offices. So quite a range of price points, a range of housing types. And they've all been really quite successful. The project is about 3/4 of the way built out right now, and they are on hold for any further residential development until the economy improves. This one also, as I said, was initially, the land defaulted to the city. The city then hired Continuum Partners and established a public-private partnership. And again, I think Continuum was really learning from Mashpee and sort of saying, wow, we don't want to try to do this on our own. We need the city to work with us. So all of the rezoning was done very much in collaboration with the city. And the way that this one was financed, the infrastructure changes were funded through a sales tax subsidy to be paid off over time to the developer. So the developer front-ended. The city did not actually invest a dime. The city simply said, we will not collect the sales tax from any sales tax you generate on this property. We will not collect any of that sales tax until you've paid off as much as you invested into the infrastructure. That's been pretty interesting. I haven't heard yet how they're doing in the current economy, but I know they were actually way ahead of schedule on the sales tax generation, and so my guess is they're still doing rather well. Here's what Villa Italia this is what Belmar used to look like, the Villa Italia Mall. And again, the goal of this was a 1.3 million square foot mall, and but the form became obsolescent, and so this is what it looks like now. It has a much finer grain of ownership because the parcels, literally those public streets now, have subdivided it into smaller blocks. Each of those blocks is then further subdivided in terms of ownership by now condos that are layered above the spaces. So now, if the economy does start to drag this project down, it's not likely to be the cataclysmic collapse where, if a mall or a shopping center or a lifestyle center is only owned by one company, it goes down, whole thing's flat. Now, somebody's going to go down, but somebody else, that you've got enough vested parties, and it's really now platted and lotted just like a traditional city, and I think it is much, much more likely to endure. Time will tell, but this is what we're seeing. So we get the building typologies. This is sort of focusing in on that core. And you see a lot of wrapped boxes and public spaces. So building A is a cinemaplex, but it's lined on one side, it's wrapped with condos that above retail that face the street. And then behind it is a big parking garage, but the parking garage is also at ground level lined with artist studios. So the central image on the above are these artist studios that line the parking garage. And then the image on the upper image on the left is the public space, the skating rink, is very popular. This is not a staged photo. I mean, we went there a couple times. It was always full of people. The image on the right is called The Lab, a nonprofit art and event space that's an offshoot of the Denver Art Museum, and I think represents a very deliberate strategy by the developer to, bring civic culture, bring civic institutions to this, help this really operate as a town. Bill, you're standing there, so I'm assuming I need to close up. All right, here's Belmar's, what it looked like in 1975, the morphology with the big mall, 100 acres. Here it is in 1995 with the mall dead, but the department store getting reused. So the department store gets reused into the plan here for 2015. Really quite a remarkable transformation. And as I said, they're about 3/4 of the way there right now. It will have about 1 million square feet of office, 175 retailers, and 1,300 dwelling units. And it's also got the largest photovoltaic array on top of their parking garages. I mean, they also used green bonds for financing for this project. All the buildings are LEED. It's really quite a progressive project. So I'll just zip through the images here and barely talk about this one. This was an office park Very cool, outside of DC. This one, the buildings are staying. These are 10-story office buildings, but it's getting redeveloped on the parking lots. So a new main street is being inserted into the parking lots, as well as a lot of new development. So here's some of the new housing, funky curved condos, new public space, new main street, a lot of public art with the parking decks coming in. So it was a farm. Here it is as the office park, the 3 rectangles with a big mall next to it. Then transit came in, and that's what triggered the redevelopment. So here's where it's going. Downtown Kendall, just flip through these, outside of Miami. This one's really a case of an edge city retrofit, infilling inside an edge city. So the before condition, this is one of the, far from a dead mall, this is Dadeland Mall, the 4th largest grossing mall in the country. But it's right on Route 1, about a 300-acre parcel, also includes the 2 stations where the transit line came in, which automatically triggered new zoning. The new zoning breaks up the super blocks, but allows you can see the new 25-story residential towers and then 8-story fabric that's been built on top of the old, just sort of car dealerships and things. And so it's 1970, the mall has expanded by 1995, and transit comes in, and then now the redevelopment and sort of urbanization coming out from the transit stops. Okay, last slide really is just that, it's great to be changing the morphology at the neighborhood scale. It's crucially important, but we've also got to think about it at the regional scale. And this is just images from a competition, 1 week long hypothetical look that I led a team on to look at Atlanta in 100 years. And what we speculated about was what would it take to reverse sprawl for Atlanta? And we argued that, well, first thing, we've got to, just load up every corridor, both rail corridor and commercial strip corridor, with transit. Absolutely funnel a lot more of the redevelopment along those transit corridors. At the same time, establish 1,000-foot buffers around streams. We're in a major drought. Water is just as finite a resource as oil. And in 100 years, I think we're going to need much more localized water protection. So then we argued that the subdivisions that were either in the future, if they're either too close to water or too far from transit, they get regreened. And we use an eco-acre transfer of development rights to allow them to transfer their development rights to the transit corridors, and that those areas become regreened into being food production and energy production sites. So looking at a new area. Now, I was going to talk about some of the failures. That was going to be my last slides, but I think we're out of time, because I know Bill really wanted to talk about what are the failures. And very quickly, I'll say failures often come on the public side when there's a change of leadership and a lack of follow-through. There are a bunch of these projects that they go a certain distance, and then someone allows somebody to come in and build a perfectly suburban office building in the middle of what was an urban plan that everybody had bought off on, but no, it collapsed. There also are cases on the private side of impatient capital. Santana Row is a project that the CEO had to resign because he simply wasn't meeting the investors' needs. The project took too long, even though within 2 years of when he was forced out, the project actually beat all expectations in financial performance. But so the importance of patient capital is also, these projects do tend to take longer than what suburban development has been used to, and that's obviously something we're going to change. So, with that,